Okay, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those joining us in the Gulf region. My name is Raymond Karam and I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar looking at the key elements of Saudi social transformation post-coronavirus. We have a terrific audience with us today with over 460 registered attendees tuning in from all around the world. And we have a fantastic lineup with some of the most exciting voices on this topic. This program is part of a wider initiative at AGSIW looking at how Gulf societies can best emerge from the coronavirus pandemic. And we're very excited to partner with the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and Dr. Mark Thompson to present this program today. After my quick introduction, I'll pass the microphone over to Mark. But first, as a quick introduction, Dr. Mark Thompson is a Senior Associate Fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. He was Assistant Professor for Middle East Studies at the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Tehran, where he taught undergraduate courses in international relations and globalization from 2012 to 2019. He has lived and worked in Saudi Arabia since 2001. He is the author of Being Young Male and Saudi, Identity and Politics in a Globalized Kingdom. And we hosted back in end of February, if I'm not mistaken, or early March. Time just feels it feels so long ago, but it hasn't been that long. With Dr. Thompson, and you can find the conversation on the book, which was really fascinating and was moderated by Dr. Kristin Diwan from AGSIW on our website, and I really recommend that to everyone who's interested in the topic. Dr. Thompson holds a PhD from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Before I pass it on to him, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer to say that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website tomorrow. Also, a quick reminder to our audience, you are in listen-only mode and you're able to ask your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Separately, you can also email us at info@agsw.org or tag us on Twitter at Gulf States Inst. This conversation is also being live streamed on the King Faisal Center's YouTube channel. With that, Mark, over to you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you, Raymond, for your introduction and for your kind words. Firstly, a very warm welcome to everybody joining us for this event on key elements of Saudi social transformation post-coronavirus. King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh is delighted to co-host this event with our colleagues at Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. And we'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody at the Institute for joining us and also for all of your assistance. As Raymond said, I'm at the King Faisal Center. I'm also head of the Socioeconomics Unit, the new unit we've just recently set up, and I'll be chairing today. And with me is my colleague, Dr. Kristin Diwan, who is the senior resident at AGSIW, and she's going to be our principal discussant for this event. Now, as we all know, Saudi Arabia has been undertaking a very rapid program of social reform in hoping to diversify the economy, but also, of course, to answer the aspirations of this new generation of very aspirational young Saudis. But obviously, as everywhere in the world, the government's agenda is being challenged by the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, and also in Saudi Arabia by the decrease in oil prices. And this obviously raises a number of very important questions. So, for example, how will new economic realities affect labor markets and the social space, particularly the advances made by Saudi women in the last few years? How will the limitations on mobility that we see at the moment impact key engines of economic diversification, such as tourism? How are cultural institutions reacting to these new challenges, or to what some people are already calling this new normal? And I think very importantly, can we identify opportunities here and not just challenges in these disruptions? So to delve deeper into these issues, we're very fortunate to have three excellent Saudi speakers joining us today. Firstly, Ghadah Alharthi, who's a Middle East specialist and associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's University of Arts, London. Hanaa Almoaibed, who's a research fellow at King Faisal Center. Ahmed Alowfi, who is non-resident senior researcher and head of the Cultural Studies Unit, also at King Faisal Center. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Just to reiterate what Raymond said, before we start the discussion, there will be a Q&A session later, but you can post your questions or indeed your comments at any time during this session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page. And I'll try and come to as many of these as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kristin and our speakers. Kristin.
Great. So thank you, Mark, and I wanted to thank you as well personally for working with our team on this, and especially all the folks at the King Faisal Center. We're really pleased to be doing this joint event. And as you mentioned, I mean, when we look at Saudi Arabia, and I think all of us watching Saudi Arabia today have been really struck by the, tremendous changes that are taking place across the state. But a lot of the changes that have been most striking, I think, have been in Saudi society. So we're really thrilled to have this opportunity, as you mentioned, with three Saudis, to kind of take a step back and think about some of those key changes. And I think you mentioned a few of the fields that we're going to be focusing on today, whether we look at these new ambitious investments that have been taking place in tourism and entertainment, when we look at the quite extraordinary new openings for women in labor markets and more kind of push to bring more women into public space. And also a lot of the new enterprises that we're seeing in arts and design, really driven by this kind of new generation of Saudi creatives and a lot of things that they're bringing to the fore. So what we're going to do, I guess, is turn to each of our wonderful panelists and to allow them to kind of give us an update and overview of these different fields and how they kind of have seen them developing. And then we're going to go more a little bit in depth with each of them in a discussion kind of fashion, just to start to get into how these kind of advances or the way that things have been developing might really be challenged by obviously the new fiscal situation and a lot of the other challenges that are being imposed by both the coronavirus pandemic and the economic challenges. And then we'll turn to Q&A. So that's kind of how we're going to go forth. So why don't we start with Dr. Ghadah? I think you were going to talk to us initially about a lot of the changes that have been happening and the investments in tourism and entertainment. So I'll pass it on to you, Ms. Alharthi.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Raymond and Mark. And hi, everybody. First, let me tell you what's been happening in tourism in the country. It starts with Vision 2030, a manifesto outlining the kingdom's plan for social, economic, and cultural development. And under the Vibrant Society pillar, we find different action plans for promoting culture and entertainment, developing cities, and achieving environmental sustainability. And some of the expected results of the vision is that 3 cities will be recognized in the top-ranked 100 cities in the world, and also to double the number of Saudi heritage sites registered with UNESCO. I think there's about 5 now, like historic Jeddah and Turayf and Al-Dir'iyya, which I'll tell you more about in a bit. And in February 2020, to reinforce Saudi Arabia's push to become a global tourism hub, the Saudi Commission for Tourism and National Heritage was transformed by a royal decree into an independent ministry, the Ministry of Tourism. And currently the tourism industry contributes up to 3.6% of GDP. And by 2030, the goal is to increase that number up to 10%. And it's obvious that tourism and entertainment are vital aspects in achieving many goals, like attract investments, increase revenues, and create job opportunities for citizens. So the government has also actively pursued a marketing strategy with the Discover Saudi campaign, which was later rolled into the Visit Saudi campaign ahead of the e-visa launch. The launch of the tourism e-visa in September was a landmark step in the development of Saudi's tourism sector. The e-visa application is easily accessible online, and turnaround is estimated to take between 24 and 72 hours. I know an American family that got their e-visa in less than a day. So since the announcement, more than 500,000 visas were issued up until the coronavirus outbreak in late February. This brings me to what are the major initiatives the country's been working on. There are 11 seasons that are organized in many cities at different times throughout the year. There are festivals and events like Historic Jeddah Festival, Winter Al-Tantura in Al-Ula, including concerts, local engagements, cultural and religious events. And each one of these will generate high financial returns. One of the seasons I've enjoyed with my family is the Riyadh season. It was super packed at every site every day, but very well planned. Tickets and check-in were all done through user-friendly phone applications. I can say that it really offered a smooth and accessible experience. My sister, who was 14, was able to book by herself and create a personalized experience for us through the Saudi Seasons app. You could book restaurants, find tour guides, rent a car, even rent a helicopter through the app. And from a visitor's point of view, I think it was an amazing and successful season. So Saudi Arabia also has several projects under development, which I'm sure you've heard of. There's the Amalab Giga project. It's a futuristic project that aims to develop luxurious tourism infrastructure along the Red Sea coast. Then we have an entertainment city in Ghadah, south of Riyadh. It will include major theme parks, safari and motorsports avenues. And one of my favorites is the Dir'iyah Gate, which will be home to a diverse collection of museums and galleries. And a part of it was open in the Riyadh season, and I managed to visit with my family. And I saw a historical part of the country become a place where people can come together and be transported into a different point in time to experience firsthand the historical stories of their ancestors, but with the added bonus of ACs. Also, Al-Ula is a place of extraordinary human and natural heritage. Then there is Neom, which is a transnational city and economic zone. So all these locations have always had so much potential. And now with Saudi's plan for tourism and Vision 2030, they will have positive direct and indirect effects on the economy and the lives of Saudis. Now, how has all that been impacted by COVID-19? The Ministry of Tourism is chairing the G20 Tourism Working Group under the Saudi G20 presidency. And they're developing a consensus on international tourism policy and responses during one of the most troubling times for the sector. A tourism ministers meeting was called in April to discuss the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had on the sector and to coordinate a recovery plan. So then the Ministry of Tourism announced in June that the government plans to start a tourism development fund with an initial $4 billion investment as part of its plan to diversify the Saudi economy in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. It also launched a Saudi summer initiative with the slogan Tanaffas, which is Arabic for breathe, which I think is an interesting choice for a summer vacation slogan during a pandemic. But I think after the curfew on lockdown, people really needed to breathe. And the initiative aims to promote domestic tourism. And the campaign was aligned with coronavirus preventative measures, giving citizens and residents the opportunity to explore the country in the easing of COVID-19 restrictions. So from June to September, the campaign is promoting 10 domestic destinations. And there is so much diversity in these locations, from cool climates and mountains to quiet beaches. What is interesting is that these are locations that have always existed in Saudi. However, the way people perceive these destinations is the real transformation. And that was an interesting plus from the suspension of international flights for the past few months, is that it presented Saudis the opportunity to travel domestically and to discover their country. I know families who visited their ancestors' farms in Taif, climbed mountains in Abha, drove down the Red Sea coast to visit different cities and sites. So just to close out, previously, the primary purpose for domestic travel was, visiting family and friends, for pilgrim trips, for business. However, with the development of places to visit and experience in Saudi Arabia that are similar to other international destinations, things are expected to change, and there will be a great dependence on domestic tourism during the coming period. Another important plus to consider is perception. The perception of Saudi Arabia in the global community is bound to be positively influenced by the opening of the country and once tourists experience the authentic Saudi, the cuisine, the heritage, the music, the amazing adventures. I have many international friends who want to visit the country for the first time and see all the new giga projects. And those giga projects were created and designed and studied very well. If we are looking for ecotourism and responsible tourism, there's the Red Sea project. Health and well-being, the Amala. Technology and business, it's NEOM. Heritage and culture, it's Dir'iyya and Al-Ula. So there is something for everyone. And thank you. And back to you, Kristin.
Sure. Thank you, Ghadah. So yeah, it sounds like a very ambitious agenda. So we'll have to get a little bit further into that after we've heard from the other speakers. So why don't we talk to Dr. Almoaibed now? I think you were going to talk to us a little bit about the changes that have been happening in the labor markets, and in particular, the push really to bring more women into both the workplace and also into public life. So can you tell us a bit about those initiatives that have been taking place? Sorry, I think Hanaa, you're muted. There you go.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. Thank you to the Arab Gulf States Institute and King Faisal Center. So before delving kind of into the impacts of COVID on kind of the social transformation and the impact on women's employment, I'd like to begin with a little bit of an overview of kind of existing patterns of employment. I want to say that the push to increase women's participation in the labor force arguably began kind of with King Abdullah in the early 2000s, both from a legal and an administrative kind of standpoint, and a cultural one as well. And things have been gradually improving. So today, between 22 to 25% of women are in the labor force, which is up from about 16% in the early 2000s. And it was Saudization kind of quotas that really kind of sparked this. So companies were rewarded for employing women, and there were regulatory frameworks that were put into place. So private sector companies would have to create spaces, separate spaces for women to work. And that really, it played on into kind of that social perception that these spaces are now more acceptable working spaces for women. I think it's important to kind of point out that within Saudi Arabia, expatriates still do outnumber the number of Saudis in the labor market. Women's unemployment is around 28%, and there's about 46% of the labor market is expatriates. So women aren't necessarily replacing that. So even if it kind of started with a shift in Saudization policies, we're not necessarily seeing that. But I do think that COVID here might be, a positive step to reduce that unemployment number, because, the Saudi media reported that about 1.2 million expatriates are expected to leave in 2020. That might start to shift these numbers a little bit. I think so, these started in the early 2000s, but there was definitely a huge cultural shift that happened with Vision 2030, incredibly influential. So lots of new regulatory frameworks in addition to kind of those separate spaces. So that was almost ended and replaced with other frameworks. So basically employee conduct laws, harassment laws, and fines for violating these. And it really did take that separate space to the next level in terms of creating spaces now where, again, women themselves, but also their families might be comfortable with them being in a workplace that is more mixed. I think there's three massive shifts that have to be mentioned, which is kind of the marginalization of kind of the Public Religious Commission, the lifting of the driving ban, and of course, ending the guardianship laws. So these three things, although I don't necessarily have any quantitative data to show their impact on women's employment patterns, we can definitely assume that they have made it much easier for women to make choices if they're available to them and for their mobility. Also with the vision, women have been appointed into incredible kind of decision-making positions at an unprecedented scale, C-suite positions, foreign service, and I think that, it's definitely a place where women are now in very influential places where maybe in the past they weren't necessarily. But I think that despite this, the participation rate of females is still below global averages, and we need to kind of ask questions about why that is. Also, women's employment still is quite clustered in female-oriented sectors. So, you know, even since allowing women to work in retail, that's a very female-oriented sector everywhere else in the world, and it was male-dominated in Saudi, but as soon as women were allowed into it, now it's pretty much dominated by women. And other industries such as education and health kind of care positions are also quite female dominated, and the statistics show that kind of the clerical jobs are the largest kind of sector where women are employed. So even if women are now kind of enabled to go into all sorts of different sectors, they're not necessarily choosing to do that. And some of the obstacles are legal. So, you know, these regulatory frameworks are excellent, but childcare, for instance, still remains kind of a big obstacle. And then in a COVID or post-COVID world or extended COVID world, kind of homeschooling plus childcare could really be a double whammy for women's careers. So I think, you know, this is kind of where qualitative research comes into play. And some of the research that I did with young women, there's kind of tells a little bit more of the story of why we're still, despite kind of that top-down leadership, finding some resistance to getting women into the labor market. And I think that a lot of the young women that I spoke to, this is kind of a term that I've coined, had this can do, will do, don't have to attitude about work. So I think that women definitely value education, and you have, you know, women outnumbering men in education in certain areas. But they don't always want to use those qualifications for paid work. And I think that's because they still do kind of prioritize their role as primarily in the home. And I know that not everybody likes to hear this, but that a lot of the data does point to that. But also, if the household can remain a single income household, the wage gap between men and women in the private sector, for instance, is 32%. So it makes more sense for men to work if it's available to the family. But I think that in a post kind of G20 Saudi and in a post-COVID one, I think people are a little bit more aware of the importance of enhancing other regulations to get women into the workplace. I think, for instance, you know, if we start with the opportunity of continually enabling and empowering women to work in small scale kind of freelance and entrepreneurial work, where in a COVID world or a post-COVID world, that's an area that's gained increased status, that would allow women to further utilize those skills and not necessarily make some of the compromises that they're still not necessarily ready to make. And you know, that approach still does kind of reinforce some of those gendered tracks that young people in Saudi are following. I still think that that's a great place to start and nudge both women and their families in a direction where work opportunities are more commonplace and more accepted in different sectors. So I'll stop there, and hopefully if you have any more questions, we can expand more. Thank you.
We'll do that. Great. Thank you, Hanaa. So let's turn to Mr. Alowfi right now. And I understand that you've just finished a big study, right, for the King Faisal Center, looking at the kind of development of arts in different sectors and different kind of creative activities across Saudi Arabia. So I think you're really well placed to give us an idea about what these initiatives have been and what has been the goal, I mean, at least leading into this current era and the challenges that we now face.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark and Kristin, for putting this together. And I'm also pleased to share the panel with Ghadah and Hanaa. They made an excellent point. In the few minutes I have, I just want to try to give an overview of what's been happening in the realm of culture, which is actually challenging given how eventful the past few years have been. But I will focus more on what are the major structural changes and the rationale behind it, and then we can talk about the effect of COVID-19. So the focus is culture as a key component of the state-led transformation, specifically the creative sector. Since 2016, with the announcement of Vision 2030, the cultural realm has witnessed dramatic changes. Cultural expressions in public, like music, theater, films, was not only permitted or normalized, but also sponsored and even organized by government agencies with a busy public calendar. Such an expression have become an integral part of the public life in Saudi Arabia, and this is like felt on everyday life. And even the visitor to Saudi cities will just they can't miss the difference before and after, as Ghadah has alluded to. And this is not only about the spectacle. At the core of it, actually, there was the creation of politically empowered, well-funded institution that specializes in culture, or this different aspect that is related to culture. Maybe the key of them is the Ministry of Culture, created in 2018, and later announced 26 major initiatives that includes expensive infrastructure projects like building art academies, theater, museums. There is cultural fund for artists, filmmakers, integrating culture in public education. And actually that was followed in the beginning of 2020 with the creation of 11 organizationally independent cultural commissions. Each specializes in subsector. There is the Visual Arts Commission, Library Commission, Museum, and so on. 11 of them, let alone, of course, the popular side of culture, which is the responsibility of the General Authority for Entertainment. There's also the more regionally focused organizations like Al-Ula and Dir'iyya, which has within its strategies key cultural projects or objectives. The question now is why all this, and why culture, how culture is related to the vision. If you think about the vision, maybe at the core of the vision, we can understand it as the latest and maybe most serious reiteration of the old new objective of economic diversification. So how culture is related to that? There is actually 3 levels in which culture is mobilized or thought about as related to the economic diversification. There's first the more direct aspect, which is developing cultural industries, film industries that will contribute to the GDP. And this is actually negligible in the broader scheme of things. The more important perhaps is another level of the idea that competitive cultural production, distinctive cultural sites would enhance the attraction of the place as a tourist destination, as Ghadah mentioned. But also, I think there is even deeper level to that. There is some connection in the mind of policymakers between culture or creating a way of life that celebrate creative expressions and economic growth. It's actually linked to, informed by the discourse, constellation of discourses actually, such as knowledge economy, creative cities, that has been circulating in the region in the past perhaps two decades, in which the creative citizen is seen as a foundation to innovation, to entrepreneurship. It's the same actually leap that we can see in the thesis of creative cities, in which if you have a creative class in a city, then the city will prosper, even indirectly through attracting businesses, encouraging innovation in even other areas that is not directly connected to the creative sector. And such a policy is not novel or unique here. If we look at the regional context, other Gulf states have adopted actually the same model of cultural hubs, seeing culture, heritage, tourism as key sectors in their ambition to diversify. But what I think is unique about Saudi Arabia, and this is like extremely important, what sets the experience of Saudi Arabia apart is its particular history, where certain form of cultural expressions, say music, has been contentious, at least was contentious for different reasons. And the contrast then will be sharper, and the transformation has as a result, a deeper implication from the need to, as also mentioned, normalize the society according to what's considered to be the global normal, creating a way of life that meet the aspiration of the sector of the Saudi youth, and also one that replaces one's dominant normativity or conservative normativity in the society, and also providing raw materials for a refashioned national identity. I mean, it's too much to get into details in each of these elements, but it's important to emphasize that the centrality of culture to the vision, not only in its economic core, but also on what also the culture, the vision actually emphasized of a vibrant society and creating like a different kind of society that in which creativity seen as a central feature in the society.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. I think these three, obviously we can't cover everything in social reform with just, even with these three excellent speakers, but I think it's really given us a picture about kind of the extensiveness of the changes and the seriousness of the programs that are rooted, I mean, as we talk about a lot in, economic drivers, the real need for diversification, but as, at least a couple of the speakers have alluded to, it's really speaking to deeper things too about kind of almost a level of social engineering or a real effort to change the whole dynamics between the citizen and the state and the way that citizens think about things, as well as these drivers that are coming from below, right, for like younger generations that are really demanding kind of shifts and how Saudis interact with each other and with the state. So if we kind of have gotten this picture now of the importance of all these changes, I guess the question is now, we're all globally in this really difficult period under the coronavirus pandemic. And I think the Gulf states in particular have, special challenges, not only through the economic things that have been hitting them by trying to mitigate the virus and these health effects, of course, which we're all trying to avoid, these adverse health effects, but also because of the impact on oil demand and what that's going to mean really for the bottom line and what the state can do. So we've kind of looked at all these ambitious agendas, a lot of them being driven by the state. So maybe we can just get a little bit more in depth and try to think how this might look different or what are these special challenges that are going to take place today. And I know when I've talked to people about Saudi Arabia today, a lot of them have asked me that, like, well, do you think, the social reforms are all going to be under threat now under the current conditions? So I think that's one thing we want to kind of get deeper into. So why don't we start first with you, Ghadah. You really, I think, mapped out just the scope of the ambition, right? I mean, you were talking about trying to create 3 entire new cities, as well as a number of these huge new projects, the kind of investments that are going on, and mapped out the kind of things that a lot of Saudis can do. But, we are definitely moving into a period where we're going to see more scarcity, not only in state budgets, but also potentially, but also in disposable income for Saudis, right, as they face kind of less benefits, new fees. We could talk in particular about the tripling of the value-added tax and how that's going to affect kind of Saudi competitiveness and sort of the bottom line for Saudis. So how do you kind of see this, these really economic imperatives, I guess, meeting up with these really big ambitions that you've described and that are already underway in the kingdom?
I think right now people are definitely reevaluating their spending habits, and they're thinking a bit more whether it would be more affordable to go to Amlej or Namas. They're, by the way, like towns in Saudi. So, and also I think businesses are struggling because they're receiving less customers and they need to spend more on making sure that their space is safe and ready to receive those customers. But yeah, when there was the introduction of tax in 2018, the 5% VAT, it was cushioned by a living allowance that was added to the salaries of government employees. And then some companies saw an advertising opportunity. And I remember there was an ad that said, your tax is taken care of. So there was some tax relief then. And now with the latest increase in VAT, the country has provided the private sector with some support. There are a stimulus package. And also, I don't think it has affected people's desire to at least travel domestically when it comes to tourism and discover the country. And I remember that, in the Riyadh season, all these projects have been doing very well since 2018 until now. And I see that continuing going forward.
Okay. How about, can we talk a bit about one other challenge? I mean, we can get a bit more into that. I'm sure we'll have more questions about the fiscal challenges, especially in building kind of these big cities. But I was also wondering just about the whole challenge in the current period, and we don't know how long this will last, of Saudi's big ambitions of drawing more people into the country. And of course, in fact, we could talk about traditionally Saudi Arabia's tourism has been really grounded in religious tourism, right? And Hajj and other forms of religious tourism. So can you tell us a little bit about how Saudi managed that this year? I mean, obviously this was a huge scale back of what we normally see. And also if you could just think a bit more about kind of the challenge of bringing, not just for this, of course, where everybody is very eager to come to Saudi Arabia, but also how to challenge in bringing new people into the kingdom in this new environment where travel is really quite restricted.
When it comes to religious tourism, I'd say that usually, Kristin, we receive about 20 million people coming in for Umrah every year. And then for Hajj, the average annually is 1.8 million. So this year, we only had 10,000 people do Hajj. And it was managed very well. So far, I know that there are no registered cases for COVID-19, and that in itself is a success. I think we've all seen those photos for the tawaf around the Kaaba, and it was mesmerizing to see that. So it was managed very well. And one of the challenges maybe that Saudi faces when it comes to tourism, some of the challenges actually, and they were mentioned in the National Transformation Plan, is to increase the readiness of the tourist infrastructure. So, having transportations and hotels ready. Also, the quality of service. Is it up to par with what people would find in international destinations? And, preparing heritage sites to receive people. So they have been working on that. And one more important thing, and maybe Hanaa would, like to add some insight into that, is human capital, preparing the human capital to receive and deliver the type of service we'd like to deliver here in Saudi. And there are training programs for that. There are scholarships also. So definitely Saudi is still working on tourism. And I think at some point right now, international flights are suspended, but at some point it will open up again, and people can definitely come and discover Saudi for themselves.
Tell me, I know you told us about a lot of these new domestic initiatives, because that is obviously one way to turn. How are Saudis kind of taking to that, and how is that worked in with social reforms? I think you kind of hinted at that. I mean, is this something that Saudis didn't do much before? Is it changing the way Saudis see themselves, kind of being able to travel between different places and being encouraged to do that? And especially how it kind of links in with something that Ahmed mentioned, kind of the shift to a new kind of nationalism as being really important in the kingdom.
Yeah, I think a lot of Saudis found they were very pleasantly surprised by what's happening in Saudi right now during the summer. There is the campaign, the Tanafus campaign, and it's all over social media, it's on TV. Every day I see in the Saudi news channel and the Akhbariya channel, there are interviews with people who are traveling around Saudi, and the easing of social restrictions and the transformation in the regulatory landscape has definitely encouraged more people to travel around, has encouraged people to start their own businesses, especially women who live, up in the mountains in the southern part of Saudi. They've opened cafes in their gardens, in their homes. So I know a lot of people who have actually discovered new parts of their country, who have benefited financially from that, and who are enjoying what Saudi has to offer now.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we turn to Dr. Almoaibed then? Thank you, Ghadah. So labor markets are obviously really going to be hit by the current changes and the economic challenges that all of the countries are facing. But I wanted to have you kind of think through with us a little bit how this might impact kind of the integration of women, right? Do you think to the degree that, if we may see tougher employment, and you can correct me if you don't think this is the case, in the public sector, or still more drive for people in the private sector, how is that competition going to kind of work out for these ambitions to bring more women into labor?
I actually think it's going to be a very positive thing for women. And I think one of the main reasons is kind of something that I did mention, which is women have the skills and many of them have the qualifications already. And a lot of them would look at these as kind of a back pocket backup plan and not necessarily something that they wanted to use right away, but they have it as a safety net. And so I think that, again, if you look at some of the really interesting statistics, is the majority of people working in creative industries in Saudi are women. And if you have women who have skills and the drive to work in creative industries, then once the economic need happens to be more pressing, you can see economic growth potentially happening through more development of small and medium enterprises. I mean, there's been massive support for these in the country. And so, I think that this is an area where you're going to get potentially economic growth from people who already are qualified, maybe didn't need to work, maybe find a need to now, and are inclined to work in more creative industries. And so, both the sectors that Ghadah and Ahmed are talking about are places where you probably will see a lot of women participating in increasing numbers. You do definitely have pull in the public sector, but that is shrinking as a sector, and so the pull is not going to be as forceful. Again, I think that the resistance is there because the economic need hasn't necessarily been as strong as it could be, and you have a huge support system. So, if you didn't want to work, you potentially did not have to, and if that's changing, I think it looks good for women.
Well, that kind of leads me to think about something else that's always a dynamic in Gulf states, right? So if the upcoming period is going to, and we know this is kind of the case moving forward, everybody knows this, that Gulfis and Saudis in particular are going to have to kind of move more into the private sector, take up different kinds of jobs. That speaks to also changing relationship with foreign laborers and guest laborers, which has been, the main way that a lot of Gulf states have kind of dealt with employment in a lot of different areas and in special skills. We've seen a lot of that changing in the current, period of the pandemic. And in particular, we've had a lot of real challenges, I guess, with the guest workers and a lot of pressures in a lot of states then, again, to kind of decrease the number of guest workers in the country. Just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that dynamic and how you see that playing out, because that's been a really big topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I mentioned was that, women are now dominating in the retail sector, and that's an area where there was a huge amount of expatriates working in Saudi. So, that's an interesting kind of shift. Again, you have the regulations changing, and therefore people are adapting, and some of them happen a lot faster than others, but that's been a gradual process anyways, because it started with different types of retail shops. I think, again, thinking about domestic workers, if you have a lot of women now able to drive, if they don't have access to potentially, a domestic driver and have resistance to using other types of hired cars, then this is something that again now is not as big of a barrier. Women can make these decisions, are more mobile, which in the past it would have been very, very difficult to do if those numbers were shrinking. But I think, one of the things that I mentioned was childcare. And I think that that's really important to think about, because a lot of times people think, well, women can work in Saudi because they have access to live-in domestic workers. And I think, first of all, it's really important to say not everybody does have access. And I think it's also important to mention that potentially people may not want to hire live-in domestic workers for multiple reasons, especially as awareness increases about, kind of some of the dynamics behind that. And so I think, as families move away from their extended families into more nuclear homes, you're going to need a lot of investment in child care facilities that are provided. So right now, for instance, there's an obligation for every mall to have a daycare center for the women that are working in them. But those, they're not opening at the speed that they need to open. And so regardless of whether some of these kind of mandates are put into place and the regulatory frameworks are adjusted, these are some of the obstacles, I think, that we really need to think about areas to invest in more.
But do you think really the state commitment is still there to bringing more women into the workforce? Because I'm just wondering how that dynamic will work out if you have an employment rising, especially for men, Saudi men. Do you think we'll get more of a dynamic where there'll be some push to kind of make sure that Saudi men are employed, particularly in the public sector, more than Saudi women?
I think it depends on if the economic growth takes place or not. So if you can get more kind of small and medium enterprises popping up to grow the economy, and those can be filled by women because it's a more of an entrepreneurial kind of endeavor, then potentially it's not going to impact it. But I think that in traditional jobs, I think, yes, those traditional patterns are very persistent. And I think that, women are making the choices as well as men to continue to kind of think of young men as men and their families as the primary breadwinners. It will be interesting to see, and I think it's a space to watch because it really can go in either direction. Employees tend to be, definitely more males tend to work in both private and public sector, but employers tend to favor the work ethic of young women. And so it will be interesting to see what happens with the family dynamics there.
Great. Well, thank you. Let's turn to Ahmed now. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, when we think about budget cuts, perhaps people tend to think that the cultural realm might be something that's sort of more expendable under necessity. Are we seeing those cuts in resources, or do you expect to see them moving forward?
Actually, nothing has been announced, but it doesn't seem like it. And as you said, like at least not how observers would expect. Normally, in a time of physical strain, you would expect like these considered as secondary sectors to take most of the hit. But actually, during the time of the pandemic, June and July, two major initiatives were actually launched by the Ministry of Culture. The Cultural Scholarship Program that would give an opportunity to creatives to pursue education in prestigious universities around the world. And it's a costly program. There's also the National Cultural Awards also was announced in June. So it seems it just shows where the emphasis is put, that these cultural initiatives are not as secondary or something that is dispensable. And that actually comes in a very sharp contrast with in 2000 with previous economic previous moments of economic strain in 1983 with the oil crisis and the drop in the prices and then the state revenue. The cultural sector was significantly smaller. It was just the general presidency of social welfare. There is the semi-governmental Saudi Arabian Society for Art and Culture, it's actually the crisis brought their activities to complete halt. So what I'm trying to say is that actually shows the centrality of culture to the project. It's not something that can, a soft spot that can you start a budgetary cut from. It seems the initiatives are going. At the time of the crisis and the pandemic, the cultural commissions continue to form their board of directors, they continue to work on their strategies. And of course, there might be, it might be affected. I think all the sector across the board will be affected somehow, but it's not the effect that someone would expect that all culture will just put aside and will focus on more real welfare programs or other infrastructure programs. And if I might add one element, which is the part that hit the hardest, the events and
yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, how's the cultural ministry dealing with the fact that it's culture? A lot of it is about gathering people together, right?
Yes, actually, this element was the hardest hit, and also it was most felt. So it's actually the thing that stands out, that people interact with. The Minister of Finance announced in May that there will be rescheduling, and entertainment and culture will see. And the sector actually has been doubly affected. First by social distancing measures, which prevented the implementation of the plans, but also the indirect ones of the value added tax that will perhaps, and this is yet to be seen, will shrink the dispensable income the family have, which the spending actually on entertainment and culture in Saudi is already relatively low, and that's yet to be seen. But that being said, actually, the crisis seemed to have sharpened a pattern of government's direct engagement with the citizenry. We can see it even in how the Ministry of Health conducted, managing the crisis, and different cultural agencies in which there's very effective public messages, very effective engagement programs. The Ministry of Culture, for example, in the area of culture, swiftly developed an elaborate calendar of online competitions, interactive events. So most of these activities and the efforts was shifted to the online world in a very direct way. So I think also the ministry is not simply, and we need to see it this way, not simply a regulator that funds and empower, but clearly it's keen on making its presence felt in the area that used to be left for societal actors. So there is, you see like an elaborate calendar of events, interactive interviews, competitions.
Done by the state, by the cultural ministry.
Yes, by the cultural ministries. And in addition of other cultural institutions who actually quickly adopted to, and I think that the adaptation was very effective and the response was very quick. And that says something about the working of the bureaucracy after the Vision 2030.
Right, and like you said, also the engagement of the state. We were talking before though, and you were telling me about a lot of other initiatives that you've seen kind of informally in the cultural sector bubbling up online, and I think that kind of speaks to a lot of the creativity that we saw in Saudi Arabia. I mean, even before the current push by the state. Of course, we can talk about, a lot of the big initiatives that kind of signal this new younger generation and how their kind of ambitions and presenting a different sort of Saudi Arabia. So can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, actually, this is quite significant because when we talk about the institutions, of course, they were able to adapt and to fill the gap and try to substitute for their activities. But actually, what was more remarkable is the numerous informal groups launched cultural activities, webinars, workshops, interviews, architecture, art, film, and it seems to be informal, similar to what dominated the sector before the vision. As you said, I mean, at least from mid-2000, there has been a very active sector, youth sector in the Saudi civil society that was trying to manage informally, despite the restrictions, with some connection, like a more cosmopolitan view with connection to activities in the region and international institutions. I mean, what the crisis showed is that this did not go away. At least it's either actually gave it an opportunity to revive, or it might be just happening and overshadowed by the more spectacular events and programs. And it's already there. And what's actually interesting also is the engagement, the level of engagement is comparable to that of a resourceful institution. I mean, if we just try to judge from the number of views and interaction, a lot of these events with small groups, completely informal, and major institutions with funding, you see that the level of engagement and the success is comparable. And actually that will open another question of the equalizing potential of the online world by the online platforms by its nature eliminate the advantages in permission, funding, logistics. So you don't need a lot of resources to be active. All what you need is just people who are engaging, good internet connection, and some coordination. So as I said, I mean, the first point here would be more of revealing that informal side on how it persisted. But also it's opened the question, and actually it's an open-ended question about how the regulatory response to that would be. Because there is clearly a push to the formalization in the sector with all what formalization, what comes with formalization, with efficiency, effectiveness in mobilizing resources, and also control. I think that would be, that's something yet to be seen. With talking with some people who are active in these sectors, it's actually a question that people talk about, the classic question of the relationship between the artist and the institution. And sometimes the online, and the crisis showed that, the online or the more informal spaces for a sector from the creative community would be a more comfortable place. So yeah, I mean, it's actually it's too early to judge that. There are some initiatives that the Ministry of Culture announced, such as the Biyut al-Thaqafa cultural houses, that actually meant to accommodate the more informal and independent groups. But we will see what will happen.
Well, great. You've all opened up a lot of things for us to think about and dive into. I know that, Mark, you've been looking probably at our Q&As, which looks like there's a lot of questions. So why don't we open up to the audience and have them kind of join the conversation.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you, Kristin. Thank you to all of those of you who have submitted questions and comments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and amalgamate some of these into general themes because we're not going to have time to sort of go through them all individually, and there is obviously overlap. But before I actually go to sort of our individual speakers, I'm going to put out an amalgamated sort of couple of questions for you to think about maybe while I'm talking to your colleagues, and then maybe you can comment on that sort of a little bit later. And this really sort of, I would like you to sort of think about, or our audience have asked to sort of think about, you know, sort of post-COVID, you know, how do you see, how can the role of the private sector be increased to create jobs for young Saudis, does this mean that a re-evaluation of Saudization is now necessary, particularly at this given time? And also, is there a need for a more pragmatic approach to fostering entrepreneurship and innovation? So maybe if you could sort of think about that, and we'll sort of come back to that in a little while. So I'll go round in the same order again. So I'll go to Radha first. Radha, quite a few of the questions again are on sort of a similar theme, and that is, for example, Professor Freitag has asked here, could you please comment on who is the main target audience of the tourism program? And do you see any risks in attracting large numbers of foreign tourists, in particular sort of non-Muslim tourists to Saudi Arabia? And also, if I can just add another question onto that, you spoke about places like Al-Ula, for example, which, for those of us who've been fortunate to visit, we know are areas of absolutely beautiful natural beauty. So what is what's the balance between sort of opening these areas up to tourism, but at the same time protecting the environment?
Thank you, Mark. So I think it's first about with the strategy that the government has right now, it's about discovering Saudi, visiting Saudi, experiencing Saudi. So I was reading the other day in Arab News that 78%, and that was, I think, just last week, 78% of Saudis are curious about their country. They want to travel around and see it. So it's Saudis, it's GCC nationals, it's expats in the GCC. And in the past 2 weeks, I started going out more. I have a lower risk appetite than most people, so I wasn't really venturing outside much. But when I did go out and I went to the cafes, and I started to see that there are more and more internationals and foreigners basically in those cafes. So I started chatting with the Swedish family that was there. The other day was a Russian family. So I am seeing a lot of interest in Saudi, and they're actually based here. Obviously, they're not tourists here right now, but they were giving me really positive comments about all the changes that are happening in Saudi. And so I think we welcome Muslims and non-Muslims here to the country, of course. And there's a lot to do. There's websites and apps where you can create the perfect itinerary for your visit. If you have any concerns or questions, most likely you will find your answer in the Q&A section on those websites. And with the training programs and the licenses, they're preparing the human capital that is needed. There are language programs so people can improve their English and are able to communicate with those tourists. So I think that, yeah, definitely you're welcome to come to Saudi and not to worry.
Mm-hmm. And what about the balance between sort of opening up parts of Saudi Arabia, such as Al-Ula, but at the same time protecting the natural environment?
I mean, environmental sustainability is very important. And like you said, protecting the natural landscape. And I have a cousin that works at NEOM, and she's just telling me about, all the beautiful things that are there. And it's a part of every single plan. Whatever project they're working on right now, this is an important element of it. So they're very conscious of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Radha. Hanaa. Hello again. We've spoken a lot privately about education and its relationship to the labour market, and we've had a couple of questions sort of related to that as well. So I wonder if you could talk about does the current education system, is it aligned actually with the labour market? So are young women, as you were talking about, are they actually studying this type of subjects that will actually facilitate them going into the labour market? And I know, for example, that, as I've mentioned at the beginning, you've looked a lot on vocational training and the importance of this. So maybe you could say something about that. And also a point that was raised in the Q&A box was about, yes, we have all of these expats leaving the kingdom, but in fact, the majority of those migrant workers that are leaving are not necessarily leaving jobs that could be taken by women. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Absolutely. Yes. So my most recent research does look at kind of that transition between education to work, specifically into the vocational education sector. And there's been a big push to expand vocational training for women, as well as for young men. Ghadah has mentioned this a couple of times. There's definitely a lot of training programs where you're not necessarily going into academic education, but you're going into specifically education for skills in particular industries. And, you know, there's, I want to say, again, from my own research, young women were less averse to going into vocational training than young men were. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that women were not necessarily doing it because they, at the time, saw themselves getting it as a qualification for a very specific job. They wanted the qualifications because it enhances their potentiality, I want to say, in the labor market and in just their futures. So I think with education in particular, it's very tricky. There's not a whole lot of choice in terms of getting exactly what you want to study at university unless you do exceptionally well at the secondary level. It's quite rigid in terms of if you make a mistake in terms of picking humanities over sciences, you're kind of on a humanities track for the rest of your life unless you can go abroad, and that's not necessarily accessible to a lot of people, especially today. It had been much more accessible in the past. And so I think that it's a bit of a minefield in terms of getting the qualifications that you want, but young people do have incredibly high aspirations, and they adjust these according to what opportunities are presented to them. And so I do think that there are incredible amount of skills that are underutilized with young women in particular, and women. And I also believe that it's very much time-bound on many levels. So a lot of women will work when they are younger and then maybe leave the workforce once they get married or once they have children. And that might shift as well as economic need changes. So I think, you know, there's a lot going on. And it's not necessarily very straightforward, but I do think that there are a lot of programs that are helping people gain those skills that they might then find very useful in the labor market. In terms of a lot of the expats that are leaving Saudi and women not being able to necessarily replace them, I mean, the numbers were estimated at 1.2 million people leaving, potentially mainly in the construction sector, but not only. And again, the retail sector is another place where there have been a lot of expat, and I think women are in that sector now as well. Again, you know, the number 46% of the labor force being expatriate is a 2020 number. Obviously, it was pre-COVID, but it's still, I mean, there's still a really, even if 1.2 million people leave, there are a lot of people in the country that are still non-Saudi working in the labor force. And so I think that, you know, if there really is a genuine kind of desire, one of the questions that you asked was to think about Saudization, if there is really less of a pull for people to come to Saudi to work, I do think that there is a space for Saudis to move into that space quite readily on many kind of measures, and with the expansion of vocational training, maybe even more so. There might be a bit of a resistance by some young men to go into two-year diploma programs if they have alternatives, but I think that would move as well as economic needs shifted, as you know, with kind of the post-COVID potential outcomes.
Is that something that you see happening at the moment? I mean, do you yourself see this sort of change of mentality in sort of employment preferences?
I think that as long as salaries in the public sector remain higher than in the private sector, there's going to be a resistance. And so, you know, the private sector is increasing. There is a lot of support through organizations such as Munsha'at for entrepreneurs. There's funding available, but at the same time, there's the reason why people want to work in the public sector is still kind of, it still makes it lucrative. It's shorter working hours, it's higher salaries, it's a secure job. And so, you know, if we can change some of the, again, more of these kind of regulatory frameworks, so the private sector is perceived in that way, then yes, but there are certain things that I think need to be achieved before that shift really is a genuine one.
Okay, thank you, Hanaa. Ahmed, coming to you. We had a comment and a question here. It says that you mentioned the integration of culture in public education, yes? And are there any specific plans? If not, then could you suggest some ways culture and national identity could be implemented into teaching? And I was also, that's interesting that question came up, because that's actually something that I was actually thinking about myself. And, you know, I wondered about sort of how, to what extent is culture promoted within the education system. And I'm thinking more, if you like, not so much tertiary education, but sort of secondary education. And that really, and how does that sort of tie with what you said earlier on about how, for example, until fairly recently, a lot of these things were contentious. And you mentioned, for example, music, which we know about. And you also talked about sort of this growth of, as we've seen over, you know, many years, the importance of the informal sector doing this. But how is all of this now being addressed in formal education, or maybe going to be addressed in formal education?
Sure. So
sorry, there was a lot there.
I will try my best. Actually, most of the details about the culture in education has not been released. But what we know, actually, that first there may be two levels to it. First, there is like the specialized training of the art academies. So the art academies actually was announced, I believe, in 2019. But there is also the integration of culture in all levels of education. So there was also in 2019, there was an agreement between the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education of including culture in the curriculum. But the details still not yet. There's not much details about that. The other big actually move was with King Saud University announcing the creation of Faculty of Arts and Culture. So it seems that this is one of the initiatives, and it was very clear from what the Minister of Culture emphasized, that education is up high in the priority of the ministry. And I could add the scholarship program. So in all levels, and all kind of education, you have that. Also, in terms of regulating the training in cultural sectors, this will be something that the Commission will pick up. So for now, there is no system for, let's say, a music academy. If you want a private sector, you want to have a license for that. There is no regulatory framework for that. So that's something also the different commissions actually announced that they're working also in these frameworks in order to enable the issuing and regulating training and education within the subsectors. So yeah, I mean, there is not much yet to say about it, but this was at least what one can say. It's in all levels. There are initiatives. There are clearly high-level push to integrate that more into education.
To what extent do you see formal institutions, whether they are governmental institutions or whether they are hybrids or whether they are sort of very high-profile institutions such as MISC? There was a question about MISC, for example. To what extent are they tapping into this sort of informal sector, this huge wealth of creative talent that we know exists there?
Yeah, of course. Actually, I mean, the talents that exist, and also, I mean, key people or actors from that informal sector in the past, let's say between mid 2000 to 2015. You can see the same names, the same artists, filmmakers who join the ranks of ministries or MISC. So there is clearly this is a top-down project, but actually in order to implement that, it absorbed much of the creative community that existed informally. So I would say, yes, it's actually, we cannot just separate between the two, that this is that project and this was this period. I think there is a connection between the two. The connection, you can see it in the same faces, the people who join and actually champion in both, let's say, periods, and also in institutions' willingness to incorporate them and to have them on board. So yeah, that's.
Thank you, Ahmed. Ghadah, can I come back to you? So a couple of things that have come up for you as well. One of them was how do you see this boost in tourism affecting the sort of the status of women in Saudi Arabia, how they're going to be involved in tourism? And also here it says, you mentioned the Discover Saudi and Visit Saudi campaigns. To what extent are Saudi citizens being empowered as ambassadors for tourism, whether it's through social media or other channels? You know, are Saudis embodying the campaigns and embracing the idea of Saudi Arabia being a sort of tourism nation, whatever that might be? Can you maybe elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, of course. I'll start with the second question. So the thing is, I actually know two people who quit their jobs just to become social media influencers and travel around Saudi, you know, to take photos and make videos. And I also think that, again, with the licensing and training programs, it's a very empowering thing for people. So I've visited Medina twice, and on both trips, we've had female tour guides, and, you know, they were driving us in their cars. They were telling us that they are the breadwinners in their family. So it has definitely empowered women very much, and it changed their lives. And one thing also, I have some statistics here that I can share with you. There are 10,000 women that have taken part in the training. There are 500 female students that have benefited from scholarships and programs for hospitality and tourism. And 1,000 women are now licensed to practice tourist activities. So women have also become ambassadors, not just the men. So women have also become ambassadors for their country, and people have embraced this. I think they even found more pride in their identity and in their country. So it's been a great change to see.
Thank you. Hanaa, coming back to you, could you? I have a point question here. So could you expand on how you envisage that women themselves can overcome the sort of difficult attitudes maybe towards women working? You're on mute.
Sorry. I might actually bring a little anecdote into that. Is when I was working as a manager in a large company in the eastern province of Saudi. I was manager of my department, and I had to interface quite a bit with the government relations department, who were not very comfortable working with me directly, because most of the employees in the company were who were heads of departments were male. And so you know, it was really just the attitude that I had of asserting my position and being confident in what I needed to do. And I think that that's, you know, you just need to get a seat at the table and a foot in the door. And with more women who are being put into decision-making positions, there's going to be increased kind of policies and procedures put into place in different companies, but also at that broader level where women are going to feel kind of confident. And once you can make the case for, being a professional in your place of work, and that's why you are there, I think then men change their attitudes. And the more that happens clearly throughout society, the more it's just going to be more normalized. And I think that really just needs to happen. I think that there is a push from both directions. There may be resistance, but you can negotiate that, especially when there's an economic need. And I think that there's more negotiation power now with more empowerment coming from the top. So.
Yeah, Ghadah just mentioned then, for example, sort of social media influencers and people like that, in all the areas that you've been discussing. So this isn't just a question for you, Hanaa, but also for Ahmed and Ghadah. I mean, to what extent are role models important?
I'll just respond since definitely incredibly important. And I think that, there have been several campaigns that have been led by different ministries of highlighting successful stories of Saudis who have gone into industries that were not necessarily traditionally available to Saudis. And I think, that is incredibly inspirational. And I think that there are examples again in people who are appointed into very important positions, but there's also examples of people who have risen online through their social media profiles, and they're fascinating to watch, and young people aspire to do very similar things. And again, if it's a space issue that women are needing to negotiate with their families, that really provides a great opportunity for people to start their careers in ways that may not be pushing as many boundaries as they might need to otherwise in a physical place. And I think that that's a really good opportunity to show that you can contribute to the formal economy in an interesting way. And that would, again, shift perceptions slowly of people that may be more resistant to it.
I mean, Ahmed or Ghadah, do you have anything to add to this about role models, or?
It's actually very hard to measure any effect, but what I would say, it's a broader point than a role model. It's this celebration of art and artists actually created. Gave more symbolic value of art that people trying to pursue. It's becoming fashionable to try to become an artist or have kind of experimentation with different art venues. So I would say it's more of the state creating this norm with the celebration. We could say the role model of artists. It's just give more incentive to more people to pursue a career in that direction.
Kristin, is there anything where time is starting to disappear? Is there anything you'd like to bring in at this point?
Actually, I was just struck and listening to everybody and all the responses, and we've kind of gone through a lot of the clear challenges that are there. But I think everybody's kind of arguing that, well, the agenda is what the agenda is, and everyone's going to keep pressing forward, whether that's in the arts or in tourism. Saudi Arabia has the goals that they have set out, that this is a deeper, generational change and economic demands that are required, and we're just going to be moving forward. And I'm just wondering, I want to press you a little bit further, how realistic this really is, because it really is big challenges right now. I mean, globally, all of us are going to be facing enormous economic challenges, social challenges. There's a big challenge to the whole nature of globalization as it stands, right? I mean, and I think the Saudi vision is really anchored not only in a Saudi nationalism, but also in bringing Saudi much more open to the world and bringing the world, in a different way, engaging with Saudi Arabia. So I thought I'd just end pressing you a little bit more about if we've really accounted for the challenges, and you really don't see a shift in a fundamental shift in kind of the agenda and the priorities moving forward, driven by necessity of the changed circumstances.
Yes. Ghadah, would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm thinking about how it may affect Saudis. Like I mentioned before, they're evaluating their spending habits, but also when it comes to employment opportunities. There's the Nitaqat program, and I'm talking now about the tourism sector. So there's the participation of Saudis in the tourism sector is under 50%. So there's the Nitaqat program that has incentives and mandates for businesses to hire more Saudis. And when it comes to the private sector, now the part of the Vision 2030, and also, you know, one of the objectives is diversification, right? So they are planning on reviving the private sector, especially now post-COVID-19. There's a lot of focus on the digital transformation program, e-government. So there are plans to recover. And with the $4 billion the fund that I mentioned also, and the investments made by PIF, there's definitely a lot of work being done to mitigate the crisis right now.
Thank you, Radha. Hanaa?
I think that, you know, absolutely major challenges facing the whole world. For women's employment, that's not going to be necessarily the worst thing in Saudi. I think it's actually going to help kind of create more acceptance for women in the workplace as economic need increases and women have skills that they can utilize. So I actually think that the challenges in that sense are going to be beneficial for that space. I think, you know, there hasn't necessarily been that economic need for women to work in the past, and that shift might be what we need to get more women there, showing that, you know, this can be normalized and it's going to be beneficial in that space, I think.
Thank you. Ahmed?
So the main point, before the main point, I can't speak to the bigger picture of the budget and challenges in the fiscal policies in general. That's I think is a question, and it's a big question. If things continue this way, these investments have to actually produce quicker results, and which is usually not the case. Investments in tourism, in culture, building industries from the scratch, that's a long-term game that actually will be very challenging to sustain with the pressure on state revenues. But the point I want to focus on here is, I mean, whether the changes will take us to different directions. I think it's completely possible and open. But that will be based on the new reality that has been created. So that's the point I'm trying to emphasize. So this is not like a temporary change that then thing will pursue or reverse. It's more of in the cultural realm, we can think of, okay, after building the institution, now the field is in flux, and there's so many changes, and it's very hard to follow. And when that stabilizes, when there is institution, there are spaces, what kind of different possibilities or different trends, or including the formality, informality, institution, intellectual that I mentioned before.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you to everybody in our audience for attending, and also thank you to all of you for your questions and comments. Of course, a very big thank you to our three speakers. Thank you very much, Kristin, for being the discussant here. Thank you for all of you for sharing your insights. Finally, we hope to see you at other events organised by King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. So please keep an eye out, look at our social media calendars and schedules, which are posted regularly. if we don't see you soon in person, which we sure will happen at some point, then I would like to say, well, please, everybody keep safe and well. And thank you very much indeed for participating today. Thank you and goodbye.